wanted to talk about this is because it's something that we, I think a lot of practitioners acknowledge, but it's something that's kind of not part of our general narrative around IPV perpetration, intimate partner violence perpetration. So I think it's really important to kind of bring this to the forefront of everybody's mind in this topic. So I hope you'll excuse me that this is a really broad overview of the research that exists. So I'm also going to do a little bit of context setting here in terms of thinking about how we've got to where we are today in terms of working with IPV perpetration. And that history is really important to think about, probably why this is quite a controversial topic and why we might be a little bit stuck in the field. And then think about, okay, what is working, what might be the kind of move forward, and how does what we know about the pathways to IPV perpetration, how do I think that now needs to shape where we go with this field? And like I say, I've seen a lot of names in here that I recognise and people that I know are working in the field and will be really familiar with this narrative as well. But I hope it kind of gives us a sense of where I think we need to move forward to in this field. So the kind of research that I've done, this is coming up really tiny on my screen, but I hope people can kind of just get the general idea here, is that so I did my PhD research on the treatment needs of women and men who have perpetrated IPV. And then since then, which was coming up to, started that about 10 years ago now, since then, and kind of post PhD, been working at Nottingham Trent University. I'm a principal lecturer there, and been involved in various bits of research looking at both victims and perpetrators of IPV, thinking about what works with perpetration, how do we best intervene, what do victims need, what do perpetrators need, and really realizing how spiky a conversation it actually is, and how controversial it can be. But I just kind of wanted to give a flavour of the kinds of publications that I've been involved in, the kinds of little studies I've been involved in over the years, to try and give a sense that I hope it comes across that I look at this from quite a holistic point of view. And again, I know I'll be preaching to the converted a lot here, but it's quite hard often to talk about what needs to be done with people who perpetrate, when the focus, particularly in this field, has been very much about what victims need, and quite rightly so. So it's that sense of trying to understand how we work with people who perpetrate, so that we can reduce and minimise victimisation. Oh, look at that, my random animation there, apologies. So the controversies are around, I've done some work around women as people who've perpetrated IPV, men as victims of IPV, IPV and same-sex relationships. They're the kind of where the really obvious controversies in this topic are. But also when we start thinking about how best to support victims, how best to intervene with people who perpetrate, this is where, like I say, the kind of unexpected controversies come from for me. So is it best that we, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but best that we stick with our most popular Duluth model that exists at the moment, a CBT psychoeducational approach? I'm going to suggest that we need to move much more towards a trauma-informed, strength-based, emotion regulation-based approach. And it's also what the debate is around whether we should be kind of gender-based, gender-led, or gender-informed in terms of our response here as well. And again, I hope that becomes clear as we talk through today. So how did we get to where we are? Why are we in the position where we kind of have these debates and controversy still in the field? So the narrative around IPV, domestic violence and abuse, has quite rightly become louder over the last few decades. We know far more and more than enough about why it's important to address, that it's a public health problem, the severe and long-lasting impacts of that, both physical health wise and mental health wise. And we know that that's been driven by that feminist activism, 70s, 80s, our shift of view about whether it's viewed as a crime, as it once was perhaps not, the changes that we see in the criminal justice system, attitudes towards DVA, and then of course we've seen this real growth in research activism funding as a result of that narrative shifting. So what that has meant for how we work with perpetrators, and please forgive me for occasionally using the shorthand term perpetrators. I think we're, again, with IPV, we're still in a position where it feels okay, if I put in inverted commas, to use the term perpetrator. So apologies if I try to avoid using that if I can, but apologies for where I do still. So for those who perpetrate, that intervention approach grew from victim services, which again is probably slightly different to some of our other approaches to other offences. There was a recognition of, the problem of the perpetrator, the recognition of the revolving door with people who perpetrate, that victim services were seeing the same women come through time and time again, and the same men being identified as those who perpetrate. So there was a need to develop that field and start doing more with people who perpetrated and not just victims. And that, of course, wasn't without its controversy, its reluctance, its division within victim services at that time as well. So we saw then the introduction of the Duluth model. If any of you are familiar with interventions for IPV, you will probably be familiar with the Duluth model of intervention that came from the States in the 80s. It really was about centering the victim at the heart of services, and about centering a shared responsibility and understanding when it came to perpetration. We then, as time moves on, see the incorporation of CBT approaches as they became quite popular in terms of offending behaviour programmes, and a replication of that model in the States over in the UK, over here in the 80s, 90s. Those of us who remember the time from the late 90s, early 2000s, in terms of the, dare I say, was that the height of our HMP interventions at that time. Very psychoeducational approach, CBT approaches. The group work was the popular model for intervening them, and still is to this day as well. And this is what we get then in terms of how that looks and what those group interventions might have looked like. So today, that Duluth model is still fairly influential. We think it is quite hard to know exactly what services exist and where and what they're doing, but we think that Duluth model is still largely influential. But we're talking about not only the prison and probation service interventions that exist, but also what are probably hundreds, maybe kind of getting into the hundreds of community programs that exist to deliver these type of interventions, so often delivered by charitable or third sector organisations, and again often in conjunction with victim services as well. From what we know, they're largely psychoeducational CBT approaches, teaching awareness of what domestic violence and abuse is, tackling thinking patterns, behaviour patterns, encouraging participants to think about impact and consequences, and an encouragement of taking responsibility. That's a real core, sometimes a requirement for our interventions with people who perpetrate as well. We've got some teaching of social skills, and again, lots of you will be familiar with this, teaching participants to change their thinking about the situation, the person, the relationship. But are they working? And this is why I think that kind of historical view is really, really important to consider, because actually the evidence suggests that we are quite stuck in terms of how effective these interventions are. So I'm not going to talk about these papers in particular detail, but we've got a kind of handful of quite key large-scale meta-analyses, systematic reviews that have looked at the effectiveness of interventions that are based on this kind of Duluth CBT psychoeducational approach. And we generally find, that kind of last concluding sentence there, that there is really quite little convincing evidence that they are working to reduce violence within relationships. So we're in this position where there's lots of this work going on that we don't really know what it looks like across the entire sector. We don't really think it's particularly effective. It will be in some cases, of course, but so we've probably still got this problem of the revolving door. We also know that there's fairly high attrition linked to IPV perpetrator programs. Again, we think that there is. The monitoring of that is not as systematic as it should be, perhaps. We have problems, particularly in our community programs, with engaging with the highest risk people who perpetrate. They are often those who drop out. And the question that I kind of want to raise in terms of then our move to thinking about, okay, what's the importance of trauma here, is whether just teaching awareness and skills is enough, because what that is doing is focusing on a single factor explanation for IPV perpetration. And our other problem in the sector is the effectiveness and the robustness of the evaluations that exist. So even where evaluations are kind of lauded as good evidence of what's working, actually when you kind of dig behind how those evaluations are conducted, they're not as robust as they perhaps could be. And I'm not saying that I know loads and loads about evaluation and that I could do this largely better than anybody else, but I think it's just worth waving that flag to say, hang on a minute, even where we're evaluating and we're concluding that something's working, actually that's quite limited. So you may have heard of Project Mirable, which asked the question, do domestic violence perpetrator programs actually work in reducing men's violence and abuse and increasing the freedom of women and children? And the kind of overarching message from that has been that some of the programs that are linked to certain charitable organisations are working. But actually, when you dig down to look at the outcome measures, they're not really explicit measures of violence or abuse. They're often measures of partners' perceptions. And that's really, really important in us thinking about IPV perpetration, but it doesn't perhaps give us the whole picture of what's going on. And we also still see this high degree of attrition in taking part in evaluations, let alone in taking part in interventions. And again, kind of buried in one particular report is the quote, it largely found there to be no significant differences in reductions in violence and abuse between treatment and control groups. So we are really struggling to find the evidence that there's something out there that's working particularly well. We recently had the HMI probation thematic inspection of work undertaken related to domestic abuse. Looked at, did an oversight of accredited programs, structured interventions toolkits, and we see from that within the probation service that there is, again, a really there's a complex system that exists. Recording is particularly complex. We see low numbers of completions, lots of issues about training and support for staff in probation, heavy workloads. Again, this will be a picture that's really familiar for a lot of you. And we've recently conducted a stakeholder mapping project at NTU at Nottingham Trent to think about what existed in the Midlands related to, what domestic violence services exist in the Midlands, and that was really complex. It took us a year just to try and work out who was doing what work in the area, and we ran a couple of networking events to bring people together, and these individual third sector organisations didn't know exactly what people were doing and didn't know who existed in the field. So it's really is quite a complex, I'm reluctant to use the word messy, but a real kind of scattered approach to working with domestic violence that I really feel needs to be improved. And we know this is problematic when we think about the R&R model that's been around for a long time now. It really has driven our understanding about addressing criminogenic need. We know that in order to reduce risk, we must address criminogenic need. Power and control as that single factor explanation for IPV perpetration are important to understand, and it is part of the picture and part of the explanation. But we are having so many more conversations now about how trauma histories are also a really important part of that pathway to IPV perpetration, and need to be more of our understanding around why IPV perpetration takes place. And when I conducted my own my PhD research, kind of looking at, like I say, women and men who perpetrated IPV, I very much expected to find really complex trauma scattered histories in the women that I interviewed, and I did, but I don't think I expected to find that so deeply ingrained for the men as well. And that was what was so, I guess, kind of shocking to me first coming into researching in this field, was how traumatic those histories were, and how the instability and the abuse that people had experienced was not something that people were talking about in relation to men. And again, as practitioners, I know I have these conversations with you guys in the field, and those of you who are working in the field, and I know that you're all aware of this, but it seems to be at that kind of higher policy level, intervention development level, that we're just not having this conversation around why trauma is so important. So it raises a question for me around whether we're confident that our current interventions are targeting the correct needs for people, the array of risk factors that IPV perpetrators come to the door with. And I think it's a really important point for us to think about, okay, exactly what do we mean by a risk factor? So for the nerds in all of us really thinking kind of around what that actually means, it may sound obvious, but it's that thing that we want to target in treatment, in intervention. The factor needs to be associated with the phenomenon under study, and we need that factor to be able to, it's malleable, it's changeable by the treatment or the intervention. And in changing that factor, that reduces the risk of the phenomenon. So we're talking here, the phenomenon here is obviously IPV perpetration. So there needs to be some key things that make a risk factor a risk factor, and that make it a causal risk factor. That means we can then be confident in what we're targeting in interventions, to know that we're targeting the right thing that impacts the phenomenon, that can be changed, and that reduces the risk of the phenomenon when we do change it as well. And of course, there are loads of difficulties in terms of thinking about, okay, how the hell do you measure this then when we're talking about people who've perpetrated IPV? Same with a lot of our understanding around different offending behaviours. It's really, really difficult to get a real strong sense of what those risk factors are. And I won't read, kind of won't talk through all of these, but some of those cautions are on the screen there in terms of things that we need to be mindful of and aware of. But when we draw together all of the research evidence that does exist related to IPV perpetration, this is what we're generally broadly talking about when we can make some conclusions about what risk factors do exist. And we can separate these into kind of those distal factors and the more proximal, the closer factors to the offending behaviour. And the distal factors, we're often talking about, no surprises here, childhood trauma, maltreatment, neglect, abuse, childhood behaviour problems, parental violence, exposure to violence in the household, generational trauma. Which of course we'll all be really familiar with the phrase, the talk around ACEs. This is kind of what we're talking about here, and it's all those variety of trauma experiences that happen in people's backgrounds. Now, of course, we're talking about risk factors that we can change here, the thing that we can adapt and change in order to reduce IPV perpetration. These are things that can't be changed when those of us work, those of you working in the tertiary services, we know we can't change those background things. But what it does show up as is what the research tells us are the proximal factors, the immediate triggers to IPV perpetration. So the mental health issues that exist, substance misuse, poor emotional management, the schemas or scripts that people hold, psychopathology, suicidal ideation, personality disorder, etc., etc. And I know there's a lot of just kind of, I guess, want to acknowledge the controversy related to use of the terms like, for example, personality disorder. I won't touch on that today, but there's some, as we kind of go through as well, there's something there about how that's showing up and what that actually might be representing then as well. So it's these trauma experiences that show up in the research time and time and time again as being part of people's stories around how they get to perpetrating IPV. And for a stark reminder of what kind of trauma experiences we're talking about here, we've got this, long list of the ACEs and the other kind of measures of childhood maltreatment that we might be seeing and that are showing up in the research literature when we think about those who've perpetrated IPV. So the evidence base for that importance of trauma in people's stories is really quite overwhelming. And I think, like I've been saying, although when I speak to people, this is something that those of us on the ground are kind of aware of and knowledgeable about, this narrative does not seem to be filtering through to our development of policy, our development of interventions, the way we work with people. But the evidence base really is overwhelming. And across a range of different types of studies as well. So even where we can acknowledge the difficulties with trying to measure risk factors, with trying to measure IPV perpetration, across a range of different types of studies, we see trauma showing up time and time again. So just to give some examples here, in longitudinal studies, we see those with neglect, childhood abuse before age 12 perpetrating significantly higher rates of IPV. In community samples who are followed over time, we see that exposure to parental violence, punitive parenting means an increased risk of IPV perpetration. A lot of people will be familiar with Farrington's work, where we see the factors that are listed on the screen there: criminal father, disruptive family, poor parental supervision, high impulsivity. If all four of those are present for somebody, then around 2/3 of the sample followed, the longitudinal sample follow through here, are perpetrating IPV by their 30s. And again, the Cambridge study in delinquent development also tells us that exposure to IPV perpetration in childhood doubles the odds of women becoming IPV perpetrators in adulthood. If we look at cross-sectional studies conducted with community or other similar samples, we see, again, a similar pattern. So where we see exposures to certain ACEs, we see twofold increase of IPV perpetration. And we also start to see in the field that the more exposure to more risk factors means higher risk of IPV perpetration later on as well. In nationally representative samples, we also see, particularly with childhood sexual abuse, that direct relationship with IPV perpetration. In this particular sample, we see, again, I'm not going to kind of read through all the details here, but a range of kind of some typologies of people depending on how they've been maltreated in the past and how that links to their IPV perpetration later on in life. If we look at convicted samples, we know that high numbers of ACEs are associated with controlling behaviour, that exposure to parental violence in childhood increases the risk for domestic violence perpetration 3 times, and that IPV offenders have the highest mean ACE scores when compared to other violent offenders but who are not using IPV, and to non-violent offenders as well. And so they are kind of little pockets of bits of research that exist that showcase the link there across different sample types and different study types with IPV perpetration. I've recently conducted, as part of an evaluation of a centre that's in Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, we conducted a review of reviews, essentially. So we kind of drew together all the main messaging from the systematic reviews. And again, I won't read through all of the papers that are on here. I'm just going to kind of click through so you can see, but that bottom bullet point there, review after review after review after review, depending on what people are, different samples, different ages, etc., we see again this link. There's, however that's measured, between those early childhood experiences, negative childhood experiences, and IPV perpetration later in life. Just a little mute of some music going on there, nice little interlude. So when we then think about, okay, so how is this manifesting as targets for treatment? Because we know that those distal risk factors are there. They, you know, when we meet people who have already perpetrated IPV, and this, you know, this is very much a talk focused on thinking about those in adulthood who are perpetrating, and not thinking we've got a whole other work to do in terms of preventative work and those early interventions. But we know that those risk factors are there, they exist, they're in people's histories. So how do we target interventions to deal with them? And this is about us then thinking about, okay, so what is that path? How does that pathway look, and how is that manifesting for people when they come to intervention services? This is again really tiny on my screen. I hope everybody can see that okay, and I'm not going to read through all the details here, but this is just to show how the number of studies again that are demonstrating that those proximal links are there in terms of people's psychopathology. There, you know, broadly mental health issues have varying measurements, often depression, often anxiety, PTSD that's showing up. People's self-harm, suicidal ideation shows up as linked to IPV perpetration. Again, just to kind of caveat that with, we know that personality disorder is a rather sticky definitional topic to discuss. But there is we do see those links in existence. We do see in the research that people's need for control is showing up linked to IPV perpetration. I'll talk in a bit about some work that we're currently involved in at NTU, but we're very much kind of trying to shift that narrative around it being not about necessarily that kind of patriarchal power and control that men are have a need for in their lives, but that this is the way that trauma is showing up and manifesting for those who have perpetrated. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Substance misuse comes up time and time again, and then emotional dysregulation, which again is the argument around why a PD is perhaps not necessarily the most useful measure of the of that association between PD and IPV perpetration. Actually, what we might be talking about here is emotion dysregulation, and again various ways in which we measure that and can look at that. We see that again coming time and time again being associated with perpetration of IPV. So an incredibly complex picture. I really do not feel that we can rely on those single factor explanations that we have done for some time to think about IPV perpetration. You know, as psychologists will always argue, I think, for that case by case, individual formulation type approach with working with individuals, but we seem to be much less okay with doing that. It seems to be much less acceptable to do that with those who perpetrated IPV, and really our understanding of individuals really should be informed by the people's trauma histories to properly target the risk that they're showing up with. So where do we go from here? Trauma-informed approaches. I know that's something that's been talked about a lot in this forum before as well. but we are really pretty good, a long way to go in other areas, but we're really pretty good at applying it elsewhere compared to with IPV perpetration. And this is probably the new controversy for IPV perpetration in terms of should we be thinking about those needs from individuals, and you know, no surprise that that's something that I would argue for. And not only is that related to the efficacy of the current programs, but also we have quite a number of gaps in our delivery in terms of IPV perpetration as well. So we don't have much out there that exists. I mean, the research is really lacking as well, but in terms of same-sex relationships, gender diverse relationships, ethnic minorities, and women as perpetrators as well, we really do have those gaps in what's being offered out there for people. So there are some people, you know, talking about this paradigm shift in, this is a very States, you know, American phrase here. When we think about battery interventions, that's not what we would refer to it as in the UK. But there is this move, Babcock as well in the States, this move to thinking about how we address that unresolved trauma. So this particular paper argues that trauma-informed care is necessary but insufficient when we think about those who've perpetrated IPV. And it's about understanding, you know, the not just the knowledge of prevalence of trauma, as that research that I've showcased shows, and the impact that has on individuals, but also thinking about that real, true trauma-informed response that, like I say, we're potentially really good at or getting good at doing with other populations. This will be really familiar to people that we're moving from this asking what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and this is the way that we are starting to move to do that, and what we're arguing that needs to happen with IPV interventions as well. And in particular, then thinking about applying that strengths-based, solution-focused approach as well. So not just what happened to you, but also asking what is right about you as well. Again, something that's a really unpopular narrative and unpopular questions to ask when we're thinking about those who've perpetrated IPV. But in order to move the sector on, in order to be offering interventions that are actually tackling that unresolved trauma, and therefore to reduce victimization, I really argue that we must be moving to asking those questions now. So again, this paper is arguing here for the need to address those physiological elements of our, you know, emotional arousal, emotional regulation. How do we do that with people who've perpetrated IPV? I think we're probably talking here about principles related to ACT therapy, and then a move to tackle those to tackle teaching skills with people, rather than the other way around where we are at the minute, which is to sit people down in a room once they've acknowledged they've done wrong and try to teach skills when there may be all of this, very likely to be all of this unresolved trauma and mechanisms here that's showing up with. So we need to be considering the importance of good relational practices with this population of people. Lens Shift must of course pay careful attention to victims and survivors. We must not lose the ball in the really important and hard work that services have been doing for years to make sure the victims stay centred in our work with IPV perpetration. And gender is still really important to consider. Interventions do need to be gender informed, but I think it is just one piece of the jigsaw that we have and shouldn't be our complete focus when we're thinking about how we intervene with people who have perpetrated IPV. So there are some interventions that do exist. I've put a few examples up on there. A lot of our HMPPS interventions have also moved this way over the years as well. This is particularly kind of thinking about those community interventions that exist. And then for us at NTU, and this is just to kind of round up my talk this afternoon, then I'll shut up for a bit. I work really lucky to work really closely with Erica Bowen, who a few of you will probably know as well. And we're working quite closely. I want to acknowledge that Erica is leading a lot of this work, but we're working quite closely to try and connect these dots with our research activity at NTU. So we're currently working on a systematic review to look across studies at the verbal and non-verbal behaviours that have been found to work in therapeutic or similar environments. So trying to really think about kind of what's showing up, what particularly is it about behaviours that show up in a therapeutic approach that work with people. We are currently analysing some data from a nationally representative survey that we've conducted that has explored people's histories of trauma, concepts related to psychological flexibility and perception of their self-organisation, and how much people have perpetrated IPV. And we're currently kind of in the depths of statistical hell. I am not a quantitative researcher, so this is really hurting my brain, but to try and understand what those pathways look like. If any of you were at the DFP conference last year, Erica presented some kind of early thoughts about what might be going on here, but we are now kind of really trying to unpick with the stats what's going on. We are very soon, we've just submitted our ethics proposal, ethics approval to NRC to conduct a qualitative study with professionals, practitioners who do that work with people who perpetrate IPV, to try and get an understanding from that professional practitioner point of view how trauma might be showing up in that group work. So a bit of a call from me that if that's something that you would potentially be interested in, then that may fly on people's desks at some point in the near future, fingers crossed. And then the other piece of work that we, as a result of the survey that we've conducted, the piece of work that has now come from that, we used a measure of coercion and control in that survey that we found through a lot of the statistical analysis is just not doing what it should be doing and not measuring what it should be doing. So we really want to think about how conceptually what that means, and how we ought to be measuring that, how that shows up. And again, we are thinking about potentially we would really like a kind of expert practitioner group to be involved in that talk and that development as well. So that might also be something that we potentially reach out to people to help us work on and think about. And then our big piece of work that will be coming soon is something that we're calling Project Mosaic, so multidisciplinary approaches to stopping abuse and intimate partner conflict. And Erica and I are setting up what is, I guess, essentially a kind of a practice unit, practice project, practice related project that we want to develop and kind of feed our research activity through, but also feed some work through kind of connecting students, connecting the academic literature and connecting the practitioners to try and develop the field essentially, and work to develop so offer, you know, CPD offerings, training offerings, that kind of ilk, to try and work with those people who are working with IPV perpetration. So again, that might be something that you see us waving a flag for at some point in the future. And if it's something that you think you would like to be involved in, we would really love to hear from you. So yeah, so this is last slide here. There's a bunch of references on the end of the next few slides as well, that when people get the slides, you're very welcome to have a look at that if it's something you're interested in. But you know, the conclusions here is that one size probably does not fit all when it comes to this, you know, messy world of IPV perpetration. We do need to be targeting it differently to what we have been doing, in order to make that sustainable change, so that we are having an impact on victimisation and reducing the numbers of victims going forward. And being trauma informed is part of that jigsaw and part of that move. And I hope that kind of by doing some of this shouting out about it and talking about it over and over again, that becomes a much wider conversation and narrative that we have about IPV perpetration. Okay, so I will stop sharing. In fact, actually, before I do stop sharing, I'm just going to show this last slide. Sorry, that's got my email address and LinkedIn on as well. So feel free to please get in touch if there's anything that's of interest to people.